Hey guys, today we're talking about counter traps. So counter traps are kind of weird. I believe there is not a single counter trap here that we will find, let's see. Except for like maybe archetype specific counter traps. Like for example, Golden Land Forever. Only like cards like this typically have a hard once per turn. For example, though, what's kind of weird is that Nine Pillars of Yangzing does not have a hard once per turn, actually. And then if we go ahead and look for Prime, Prime actually also has a once per turn, a hard once per turn on both effects of Crime, which is weird, but it is what it is, I suppose. It's not like completely consistent either. Like for example, Black Shadow Squall, you can only use one Black Shadow Squall effect per turn, and only once that turn, meaning if we use the Squall negate, we have to set it the next turn, and then we can activate it again on the turn after. So, in that sense, tier kind of gross. And you can just high roll out the trap from like thin air, basically. Then we have counter, negate the activation of a counter trap and destroy it. So like this, for example, this this is also weird in because like before a certain point, like all counter traps basically did not have like a hard once per turn. In fact, Blackbird Close actually does not have a hard once per turn, right? Which is weird, but it is what it is, I guess. So then we have negate attack. This just negates attack. So this is one of the weaker ones, but cards like in general, a lot of counter traps, what they will basically end up doing is they will negate something, and it's well, it is most of the time it is not a hard once per turn. So generally it is not. So Showdown of the Secret Sense Scroll Techniques. This is also not hard once per turn. When your opponent activates a spell trap card or monster effect with the same name as a card in their graveyard, negate the activation, and if you do, destroy that card. So aside from like specific counter traps, like for example, numbers protection, for example, like mentioned before, it would not really, well, we also have Solemn Warnings, Solemn Judgment, but generally, like the generic ones do not have a hard once per turn, similar to like a Raigeki or Dark Hole. But with that out of the way, counter traps also have this weird quality about them. The weird quality in question, of course, just being the fact that counter traps can only be responded to with counter traps. And this is actually pretty interesting, because not every trap deck surprisingly plays counter traps, even though they're fairly powerful and can stop their board from getting destroyed, because the best backer removal is usually something like a spell card or a trap card. So a Solemn Judgment, which isn't even respondable, and still has the usage of being able to negate a summon, is arguably better, in my opinion, than like, well, some of the other cards they're running, because they're already going first decks anyways. But, I mean, there are some trap decks that can somewhat go second, so they don't have to commit more power to going first, because going second doesn't exist as an option. But like Solemn Judgment overall is a pretty disgusting card because of this, to an extent, right? But like on the reverse side of things, if you're playing against the so-called control player, stun, whatever, trap heavy deck, if they don't play counter traps, then you can just drop red reboot, and then their entire deck is basically nulled. That might be why some players dislike red reboot, but red reboot actually does a lot for the game just being in it. In Master Duel, this is honestly a card that's fine at 3. And I don't see any issue with red reboot being at 3, because you don't know, like, what your opponent's playing, and if there was a meta where it's just really disgusting trap stuff, then red reboot will just give you the win, right? And we won't have to deal with it. So the most notable meta where it would have been like great for red reboot to have been 3 is Eldlik meta. Eldlik meta at the start of Master Duel. Completely awful, horrendous stuff. So they played 3 of Skill Drain, they played Vanity's Emptiness, they played Imperial Order, they played all of that gross stuff, but you know what they didn't play? Counter traps. They didn't really have like a Solemn Judgment or anything, so you just have to hopefully have like your best bet is honestly evenly matched, because if you get hit by Imperial Order, you're just screwed. I know it's like a one-of, but with extra draw power as well, and like the potential to play Pot of Prosperity as well. Pot of Prosperity also being at 3 at the time, I believe. Getting Imperial Order by like banishing 6 is not like that unlikely, surprisingly. In fact, there's a decent chance of it happening. Or getting hit by like some heinous floodgate where your only option is to basically have the out, or coincidentally more or less not be affected by the floodgates. But the worst one is obviously Skill Drain, because there's just nothing you can do like under a Skill Drain unless you happen to be playing a deck that has some kind of interaction with Skill Drain, which most decks don't, so not much you can do there. Unironically, your only out to like a Skill Drain could be making access code and then banishing access code itself for cost. Like, that's a bit ridiculous, is it not? And Eldlik, of course, having the disgusting OTK line of having an Eldlik on field and then special summoning Eldlik with the Eldlik effect, and then attacking with both, going Gustav, and then burn with Gustav, I believe, is lethal. Which is pretty irritating as well. Of course, like, just randomly, Eldlik also being annoying because they can run both Gozen and Rivalry at the same time, because Eldlik plays only light monsters, and then Eldlik only plays zombie monsters, so it's like really heinous. And of course, going second, they can just use those same floodgates to kind of out your board. Because, like, let's assume you only have, like, one Spell Trap negate or maybe one Omni negate, which is, like, pretty typical, I'd say. 2 is kind of pushing it, but let's say your opponent, of course, has an Eldlik, right? So Eldlik usually trades for a card because Eldlik has an effect to basically clear stuff. Send one card to the graveyard targeted, and then that is usually enough to get rid of one interaction, and then they could potentially even attack over your monster after that by summoning back Eldlik, and Eldlik comes back as like a, what was it, like, I don't remember, 3.5k or something attack monster, I believe. But even if it didn't, battle protection, so it could attack into a 3k monster, right? Yeah, it is 3.5k. and 3.8k defense. Not destructible by card effects, nor destructible by battle, is it? No, it is destructible by battle, it's just not by card effect. Alright, whatever. So, the annoying thing is that Red Reboot, I believe, was either at 1 or straight up banned during that time. So, it was pretty awful. Having Red Reboot at least at 2 would have been helpful, because immediately after that horrendous Elblick Floodgate meta, where you're just basically getting floodgated by Elblick 24/7. And of course they have like, every single floodgate is at like 3, with the exception of like Vanities and Imperial Order. Elblick just brutalizes you, I guess. Simply because you have no way to deal with all of the floodgates super easily. The only saving grace is they didn't have Lord of the Heavenly Prison till a good amount of time later. But I don't remember if they actually had their, like, the floodgates they play hit yet. I think they might have just been semi-limited at that point. So, pretty irritating. Red Reboot would have made the difference. So anyways, as I was saying, the next kind of like horrendous trap thing that would happen to Master Duel is that you would be hit by a fairly consistent FTK constantly, and they would just be bots doing it, and it's awful. So it is, what was the card called? Dynamite FTK. So the countermeasure to this is that they ended up semi-limiting Dynamite, so it would be less consistent. But basically, what you would have to do is that to deal with Dynamite, you have to actually play less cards in your extra deck, which is just really annoying. So I believe the amount you want to go to is like 12 cards, or 12 or 13 cards in your extra deck, so that you wouldn't lose to this stupid FTK. But like if we had copies of Red Reboot, it would be much more manageable, and we would not have to deal with this, or Elblick as much. And you might be like, oh, but my control deck's affected by the... What do you want me to do about Elblick and Dynamite FTK? There's like... You have to just draw the out into these things. And if you don't have that, you just lose. Having more outs available to basically just bullshit, well, I don't see a real issue with that, personally. And especially since there's like no side deck or anything, it's best of one. It's kind of still coin flip, you know, you're still... Red Reboot doesn't do anything against the non-trap deck. The most it can do for you is like negate an imperm, but then your opponent can set another imperm, which is not hard once per turn, and then you have to either clear their back row somehow, or you have to like win the game on that turn. So no real issue with that. And in fact, just to showcase that Red Reboot's not even as good as it should be, almost. So, but one of the good things about Red Reboot Red Reboot specifically, is that Red Reboot is a counter trap, meaning it cannot be responded to. So, if we say, like, chain 1 skill drain, chain 2 Red Reboot, the only thing that could be chain 3 is a counter trap, like, for example, Solemn Judgment, or something like that, which typically was not played. So, what happens in that case is that Red Reboot would resolve, and then your opponent, if the only thing they can do is set cards and pass, then they would no longer have any responses after Red Reboot, and you are free to do whatever you want. So, that's great. But there is this, well, if your opponent has monsters, of course, they're not negated, but anyway, continuing on. So we have Tearlaman's Crime. This card is really disgusting because you can hold it for a really long time. The only way you'd be able to, like, resolve Red Reboot is if you would get rid of Crime first. So that's rough. And if your opponent is playing Tearlaments, there's like a 90% chance they have Salik as well, or just Salik, and then they can just set Crime anyways, and then you have to kill them on that turn, which is rough, to say the least. So, Salik and Crime, they're a completely degenerate combination. So, the reason being that Salik, even if you negate a tier monster, like for example Rukalos, they don't have to respond with Crime. They can just use Salik, and then Salik negate your opponent's card, right? And then that negate is permanent. So even if it's a monster with kind of two effects, like let's say Girsu, it negates both effects of Girsu by itself. It is that kind of negate, so that's really annoying. But then afterwards, they can send Rukelos and then special summon Rukelos back with Rukelos effect. And then, of course, they have the Rukelos negate again. And also, this sends a card for effect, of course. So they can do that to a shuffler, a tier card, like a tier name, whatever, and that can allow them, a tier player, to summon like Kaleido Heart, or to summon, well, Rukelos if they don't have it. They can send a Miller, they can send a Shuffler, whatever. It's just pain. It's like if they send an Ishizu tier card, whatever. It's just pain. And there's not a super whole lot you can do about this. And of course, when they do that, they're basically plussing themselves as well. Every single card in tier kind of pluses themselves in this way. This is kind of why I want like Salik and Crime to be, well, Crime doesn't really super need to be, but I think the main offender is Salik here. The Salik the Salik accessibility is really too much. Having such easy access to Salik means that they can play Crime for sure, like, and go with Crime, because just Crime is overall worse than Salik by itself. This is just like an Omni negate, kind of, right? Most of the time. So, like, an Omni negate, of course, isn't bad, but the things Salik does versus the things Crime does, there's like a night and day difference. Considering Salik can be used immediately the turn afterwards as well. And Salik is so much more, like, easily accessible than a different card that is a little bit similar. So it is, let's see, time. Time Pendulum Graph, I believe, right? Yeah. So Time Pendulum Graph has this lovely effect that basically does nothing. Your opponent cannot target spellcaster type monsters you control with trap cards or effects. Honestly, I'm not really sure what this does for you. But the next effect is the important one. You can only use the following effect of Time Pendulum Graph once per turn. You can target one Magician Pendulum monster card in your monster zone or Pendulum zone, and one card your opponent controls, destroy them. Then if this effect did not destroy two cards, you can send one card on the field to the graveyard. So in a similar way, Time Pendulum Graph does plus you as well, with this destruction effect being able to trigger stuff, but like, this is only destruction, that's generic, right? And then if this card did not destroy two cards, you can send a card on the field to the graveyard. So typically you'll want to hold on to Time Pendulum Graph for longer, but for Salik, you don't really need to do that. You can just shotgun Salik, so it's kind of brain dead too, in that sense. So there's no like super good potential for outplay on against Salik either. kind of got getting sidetracked, but counter traps, of course, not being really searchable, kind of affects, well, the why they're not played. So, even with the not hard ones per turn Yang Zing counter trap, that counter trap, I believe, requires you to tribute or destroy a Yang Zing monster or something like that. I think it's destroy because that fits with the archetype. So, you'd have to do that. And there is like counter fairies, but counter fairies is much too slow and bricks pretty damn hard, so that's no good either. And Dark Bribe, for example, this has a similar to Salt and Judgment effect, but I don't know why you would play this, because your opponent draws a card instead of just paying life points, which is... Life points are pretty worthless to an extent when you're playing, like, a control deck, in my opinion, so it's, like, not a big deal. And I do have a Royal Divine Punishment, I guess, but meh. I think the most interesting counter trap, though, is probably Tachyon Transmigration. This does not have a hard once per turn. This is a counter trap, meaning it can only be responded to with a counter trap, of course. So a spell, trap negate, or even an omni negate like Baron de Fleur would not be able to negate this. So if we go, for example, like Baron Chain 1, and then we have like, for example, I don't know, say like you chain that monster, and then DPE chains, and then like a billion different chains, right? And then you just activate Tachyon Transmigration. This would negate every single effect, I guess, in that chain made by your opponent and negate all of them. And then you would shuffle them all back into the deck, which is completely brutal. And I have made a video on Tachyon Transmigration before. It is pretty interesting, I think, the card, at least. So, during your opponent's main phase, Grand Horn of Heaven has this interesting effect. You can negate the summon, destroy that monster, then your opponent draws a card, then you end the main phase. So, I think this card is a little interesting as well. With no hard ones per turn, you can effectively skip your opponent's turn, which is a little bit funny. I think Horn of Heaven is a little bit different. Yeah, this just negates a summon, whereas this one also skips the main phase, which is kind of just hilarious. One other Yang Zing card you control. Oh, so this can destroy scales, like pendulum cards, I guess. Well, very jank, but let's see. When an effect of your opponent's XYZ monster is activated by detaching its own XYZ materials, negate the activation, and if you do, destroy it. Yeah. So counter traps, of course, being traps, need to be generally, with the exception of, like, for example, Tachyon Transmigration, they need to, of course, be set for a turn, and then they can be activated on the next, as with any trap card. So this makes them not as good going second, so in Master Duel, seeing counter traps should not happen too often, aside from like ones like Crime in particular being a really disgusting card in my opinion. Orcus Crescendo is much less annoying, since it doesn't allow your opponent to extend on your turn. But yeah, counter traps are kind of funny. But speaking of which, there's one thing I want to mention. Like, if you want to play, like, you played like Temple of Kings, technically you can, like, this is the goofiest thing ever, but you can activate Temple of Kings and then set like a trap or a counter trap and then activate it the turn it was set. So you can kind of use it as a negate or insulation for some stuff. Completely goofy and honestly arguably unreasonable, but even if you don't draw Temple of Kings, counter traps are counter traps and can negate your opponent's stuff. And it's kind of brutal. Like, let's say, for example, we summon something, Torrential Chain 1, Baron Chain 2, Chain 3, Solemn Judgment would wipe the whole board with, like, a Raigeki that you can't respond to. So, counter traps are, like, kind of strong in that way. But, of course, it requires a good amount of setup, which, like, just raw dropping down the Thunderbolt like a Raigeki doesn't require any setup. But, like, this is a little bit weaker, of course, than, like, for example, Solemn Judgment with Torrential. And the play is usually only accessible when you're going first. Going second, it's not as likely that you would be able to do that kind of play. So yeah, I think I've said everything I want to say about counter traps. I kind of held myself back a little bit from ranting about tier limits too much. But yeah, I'll see you guys in the next video. Bye.